Hello, everyone. Welcome back. Today, we are going to be talking about questions to ask when screening potential tenants. So let's get into it. Okay, so the three main questions to ask, almost universally, regardless, are these three here. Let's start with the first one, which is what is your income, and asking for proof of income. The reason for this is because we want to make sure that the person who is renting the place is able to comfortably afford it, right? Maybe they have a job letter they can give to prove their income or something like that to ensure that they do have an income and that they are going to be able to reliably pay the rent, right? Because just paying a last month's rent deposit, right, that's not necessarily proof that they're going to be able to reliably make those payments, right? And of course, someone having an income, it doesn't guarantee that they're going to reliably make the payments, but because anything can happen. Someone could lose their job, or especially with COVID, a lot of people lost their jobs, right? However, knowing that someone does have a good income is going to be a key here to make sure that they are able to afford that. The next one is their credit score. So asking for proof of credit, running a credit check, asking what their credit score is another key one as well, because that's going to show their reliability in terms of how good they are and how reliable they are at paying things when they say they're going to pay them. So if they have a car payment, for example, are they making those payments on time regularly? Right, the credit score will indicate it if they're not reliable at doing that, right? Or if they have credit card debt, for example, are they reliably making at least the minimum payments and paying off their credit cards? Things like that are important to note. And so oftentimes people will do a credit check. Now, that said, there are some people who might not have a credit score, right? Some people don't believe in borrowing any money for anything and just believe in paying everything in cash. And that doesn't necessarily mean that they are not a good potential tenant, right? So this one can vary, right? Also, if someone is a newcomer to the country, for example, they might not have a valid credit score in the country yet. So in some cases, that's something you can skip over, right? The next one is what is their rental history? So you could ask for a reference or two from a previous landlord or a previous property manager, and you can ask questions about whether or not the tenant was kind and respectful, or whether or not they paid their rent on time and were reliable with that, and did they take good care of the place? Questions like that that you would care about, as long as you're not asking for any personal information from references, as long as it's kept relevant to their rental history, then that should be good. Right. So these are things that you can absolutely ask, and I think universally should ask in general and talk about. Now, there are certain other questions that, depending on where the rental is, might be acceptable or not acceptable. So, for example, are you allowed to ask about pets? Right? Can you ask the potential tenants whether or not they have any pets, and use that as a reason to determine whether or not they're going to, live there? Right. So it depends. It depends, first of all, on the place where the rental is, because there are some places where a landlord could say there is a no pets policy or decide to prohibit certain pets because they want to do that, right? That's possible in some places, whereas in other places that's not allowed. That unless there's a specific reason why the pet is dangerous or something like that, or unless it's going to cause undue harm to people in the building or something like that, that wouldn't be allowed, right? And so in those situations, not choosing certain people due to the fact that they have a pet may not be allowed in some cases. But that said, even in somewhere like Ontario, where I don't think you're allowed to just have a no pets policy for no good reason, there's only specific reasons to prohibit certain pets. There are certain condos that have condo rules that prohibit certain pets, and whether you're an owner of the unit or a tenant of the unit, everyone is supposed to follow those rules, right? And so if even though the landlord can't just say, oh, you're not allowed to have this pet in the building, even though a landlord wouldn't be able to say that in Ontario, the condo place could say that, right? The condo place could have certain rules, which is interesting, right? That the owner of the unit can't say it, can't tell you that, but the overall corporation that owns like all the the building in general can, right? It's interesting. It's an interesting concept there, I think, for a lot of people. But that's the case in Ontario, as far as I know, right? And so there's things like that that are a gray area, or where it might depend on where you live, whether or not something like that might be good, right? Also, I do recommend doing your own research as well to see, where is it that you live, and what kinds of questions are acceptable or not acceptable, right? Now that said, let's move on to some questions that, no matter where you live, pretty much, I would imagine, are generally not good questions to ask for various reasons. So basically, anything that is too personal or that is irrelevant, for example. Oh, we haven't moved on to the next slide. Or any questions that may be discriminatory or invasive, right? So, for example, let's start with the first one. What is your religion? Right? That wouldn't make sense to ask in the context of deciding who is or isn't going to be the tenant, right? Because whether they have the same religion that you have or not, that doesn't really determine how good a tenant they're going to be, right? And so that isn't really something that should matter, right? Like that might be something you ask a close friend if you're curious about their religion. That's totally fine, but that wouldn't be something that you would ask in terms of determining who you're going to have in your property, right? So that's why that would be a no, right? Because we don't want to discriminate based on religion or choose someone based on what religion they have for this context. Another one is, what is your race or ethnicity? Same kind of thing here, where maybe we ask someone this if we're very close to them and know them very well and are curious, and it's okay to ask that in some circumstances. But again, in terms of determining who can or can't rent out our space, that is irrelevant and completely an inappropriate question to ask in that context. Absolutely. The next one, are you pregnant or do you have plans to become pregnant? Same kind of idea with that one, where, probably you only ask this to someone who you know very, very well. It's not usually an appropriate question otherwise in other circumstances, and it's certainly not an appropriate question in most cases to ask in terms of whether or not we're going to rent out our space to someone. Next one, are you disabled? Same kind of an idea here. Now, with this one, actually, there might be some people who disclose this to you, especially if they might need a certain accommodation, or they want to know how easily accessible the place is for them, or things like that. So, someone might disclose something like this, and that's fine. That's totally fine if they want to. If they would like to let you know this, or if they have a specific reason for letting you know, then that's fine. However, what wouldn't be fine in most cases would be to ask this question, right? To ask a potential tenant this on on an application form. That's what we can't allow. However, that said, if someone discloses that they are disabled in a certain way and are wanting to know how wheelchair accessible the property is, or is the property like a bungalow, or is it something with a lot of stairs that's a bit less accessible to someone who might have mobility issues, things like that, that could be key, right? Depending on the circumstances for them to decide to disclose that. But again, that's up to them. It's not something we want to ask, right? Next one, are you part of the LGBTQ community? Same kind of an idea here, where that may be discriminatory or invasive, and we don't want to choose someone based on whether or not they are part of that community. Now, they might disclose this, right? Same kind of thing, just for their own safety. There's people who may want to disclose this before they decide to sign papers with the landlord, so I can understand that as well. If they do decide to disclose, again, that's totally fine. That's not on you, but this isn't something that you would ask, right? As part of a deciding who gets to come and who does not get to come, right? So, yes. So, of course, this isn't an exhaustive list. This is just a few examples, right? So, anything that may be discriminatory or invasive, not good. Now, that said, some people might be asking, but hey, didn't we already ask? Didn't we say it's okay to ask, what is your income? And wouldn't that normally be a question you wouldn't ask people? And that's true. I know that in a lot of societies, it's not really considered socially acceptable to ask someone what their income is. However, in this case, income is relevant, right? We want to make sure that the potential tenant is able to afford the space. Now, let's say they aren't able to afford the space necessarily, then that might tell us that maybe we should ask for a cosigner, right? So, for example, if it's a student tenant who doesn't have a very high income because they're just working part-time while they're going to school. Perhaps their parent has a good enough income and is going to help them out, right? And they can be a guarantor or co-signer for that student potentially. Um, or something like that. Maybe there's someone who doesn't have a job but has proof of income in terms of in terms of other means, like maybe they have maybe they have something else, right? Some other form of proof. That's totally fine too. It doesn't have to be necessarily someone who's employed, as long as they do have the income to be able to reliably pay for the space, right? That's all we should care about there in that sense, right? So yes, we can ask about income because it is relevant to whether or not someone is going to make a good candidate, right? Someone who is not going to be able to afford the rent is not a good candidate, whereas these other things, no matter what someone's religion, race, and ethnicity is, etc., that's not really going to determine whether or not that person is going to be a good candidate, right? Or same with if we look at rental history. Well, if someone has a history of not paying their rent and we decide based on that to not choose that person because they are a potential higher risk for us for them to continue that same behavior once moving into our property, that could be a concern, right? Or if they have a very, very low credit score, like in the 400s or 500s, and have a lot of debt, have spending troubles, and aren't very reliable at making payments on time that they promise to make, then same thing, right? That pattern could repeat if they decide to move in, right? And so that's the idea here is, we have to ask ourselves kind of, well, what's relevant to us as a landlord versus what is not going to be relevant? What doesn't actually matter, or at least shouldn't matter to us as a business owner, right? So that's the important thing, right? Whereas income, that could be relevant to know in terms of, should we have a guarantor, right? Should we get a credit check from the guarantor? That kind of thing to ensure that we are, we're taking on as little risk as possible. Especially too, in a lot of times there's going to be multiple candidates. There's going to be lots of people wanting to rent out a specific space, and why choose someone who has a history of not paying rent and really isn't going to end up being able to afford the place very well, right? That isn't necessarily a very good plan. So yeah, so that's kind of some food for thought there in terms of questions to ask and also questions to not ask. And I will see everyone next time where we're going to talk about the 4 cycles of real estate. Bye everyone.